Welcome back to Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small.
I'm Paul Ogden.
We are here with our guests, Tom Ayer, who raises funds for not-for-profit corporations, and Matt Stone, blogger on Indie Student. Tom's first time here on the show today. Welcome, Tom.
It'd probably going to be his last time. He doesn't seem to like us very much.
He's probably going to get up and walk out, and Matt has, and this is his...
He has a bunch of starving children.
That's true. What, did you tell him he was getting paid?
Yeah, I know. You know you're not getting paid, don't you?
Jeez.
You'll get my mileage bill.
We're discussing the Civil War, events that led up to it. Part of this is instigated by the fact that we went to see the film Lincoln this week. Paul and I panned the movie, I think it's fair to say, in our blogs this week.
I think Matt has a slightly wrong view about it.
But we can get to that later. We were talking about events that led up to the Civil War and slavery as an aspect of society. I stated something that was not factually accurate. I said that the Missouri Compromise was in 1850, and I was inaccurate about that. It was 1820, but there were a series of compromises in 1850 that tended to delay a confrontation between the northern states and the southern states. It was a package of 5 bills, one of which was a stronger Fugitive Slave Act, that were very principal in keeping matters such that the South didn't secede. And that was another thing at the time. There was a popular belief that states could withdraw from the United States.
Well, and it wasn't like 1850 that is a new concept. Andrew Jackson was ready to invade South.
This is the second time you brought him up.
Not on, but off the air. On the air, Andrew Jackson was ready to invade South Carolina himself, leading the army himself as sitting president of the United States, because he was convinced that South Carolina was going to be the state to try to secede, and Andrew Jackson is not exactly remembered as a abolitionist type president. So there were always these frictions between the northern states and the southern states to do any number of
and I think during the the War of 1812, right around that period, there was talk about some northern states.
Massachusetts and such,
seceding from the Union. So it wasn't just a southern thing. I think a lot of those states went into the Constitutional Convention and came out of it believing, if we don't like the way things work, we can just withdraw.
Well, I think that the Constitutional Convention, in a lot of ways, was kind of a scam. It acted ultra vires, and they acted outside of their charter. They did things in wholesale fashion that no one thought they would do. The delegates themselves were surprised that they were doing.
A lot of the founding fathers were out of the country at the time. Jefferson was in France, and he actually held the belief that a constitution is probably rewritten every 10 to 20 years to keep up with the times. So he wasn't really a big fan of this whole constitution that's basically solid until the nation, dissolves or whatever.
Yeah, until he was actually president,
and then he was like, so what? Whatever.
Once he was in office, he was ruling by edict, and then he had a different view of power. It's good being.
Also, he really hated John Adams. Just wanted to be a better president than him.
Yeah, and then they became good friends.
Well, they were good friends before. They just hate each other as politicians.
Yeah, but then they got into this correspondence once they were in their later years, where they fondly reminisced and avoided talk about certain issues. But so in 1850, these compromises were reached that forestalled the Civil War, and one could argue that was a good thing, unless one was a slave living in those years under slavery, and then one would say, well, that's forestalling.
Or even a freed African American at the time.
Would you want to fight the Civil War with James Buchanan as the president?
Well, that would have been
Franklin Pierce.
Franklin Pierce.
Actually, Millard Fillmore was in office in 1851.
Yeah, it would have been Millard Fillmore, because Zachary Taylor was not really. He really didn't want to compromise with the southern states, even though he was a Southerner himself. And ironically, Jefferson Davis, of course, was his son-in-law as well. But he really didn't want to compromise with the South on any of these issues, and was a strictly Union man. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, he died off. You had Millard Fillmore in there, and then compromise was reached. And one of the things that came out of it, of course, was this very draconian Fugitive Slave Act that I think really galvanized the northern states. Whereas prior to then, they might have had, sort of they may not have been racially enlightened, but they had a perspective that it essentially turned everyday citizens into slave catchers.
Explain the fugitives.
Well, essentially, if a slave escaped from Kentucky into Indiana, the local sheriff had to round up a posse of local citizens, and they really didn't have a choice in the way that the law was written. You had to join up and catch this slave, send him back south, or else you would be considered to be part of, somebody that's enabling, freeing of slaves and so on. And if you happened to be caught, along the Underground Railroad or whatever the case may be, there were very draconian penalties for that kind of thing. And so I think that while it kept the South in the Union at that time, I think galvanized the North because it kind of raised up our sort of American idea that you can't tell me what to do.
Were there cases of like local sheriffs and citizens being prosecuted under that law, either rightly or wrongly, for helping, like, with someone, if a sheriff just said, I'm not going to waste time hunting down someone else's, hunting down a runaway slave? Were there cases of sheriffs actually getting in trouble with the feds on that?
That's a good question. I can think of specific examples that happened in Boston itself where, you had local authorities, or federal authorities, if you will, attempting to move in, recapture a slave, and the local people said no way, essentially rose up in mass that you can't do this and help this person move on out of there. And of course, as you pointed out off air, one of the things that happened was a lot of the freedmen or former slaves or whatever would just move on into Canada because it was such a draconian law that
even those with official papers and whatnot,
right, would want to get out of the country.
Had a risk of going back into slavery, or if they were born free and never were enslaved, had a risk of being put into that position.
The state of Wisconsin declared it unconstitutional, the Fugitive Slave Act, in 1854, and then
nullification.
In Vermont, approved a habeas corpus law requiring its judicial and law enforcement officials to assist captured fugitive slaves. So there was a spin very much against that act, but then everything was thrown helter-skelter in 1857 when the Dred Scott decision was handed down by the Taney Court. And that was perhaps, in one fell swoop, one of the worst decisions handed down by a United States Supreme Court. And two, there was nothing that was like pro-rights, human rights about the decision.
What exactly was the decision that the Dred Scott case handed down?
Dred Scott was a slave who was in a free state, and the argument was that since he was in the free state, then he had his liberty.
Should have been free.
It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court could have dodged the issue, and that is usually what a higher court does if it's a really contentious matter, like, say, same-gender marriage. A court will avoid on procedural grounds.
Like saying you had no right to bring up this case?
Well, you had no real need to consider the case, and so we're not going to consider it at this time. Taney went out of his way and wrote this opinion that said that African Americans, although he didn't use that phrase, were not equal to white Americans. He declared the acts that were passed in compromise unconstitutional, and essentially put the United States on a footing where we were going to be in a civil war. I mean, the South, it was putting the northern states in a position where they couldn't tolerate what the court had done, and the South couldn't tolerate what the North was going to do.
What Chief Justice Taney was attempting to do was, settle this question once and for all, and that at times can be just disastrous, which it turned out to be the case. Voiding all the compromise, especially the Missouri Compromise in 1820, where you had kind of drawn this line where slavery would not be north of that, and voided the whole thing, declared African Americans as non-citizens with no rights whatsoever, and once again had galvanized the North. There's one other part of this equation the things that had been going on in Kansas in the 1850s, the
Bloody
attempt to
Kansas.
introduce Kansas as a free state or as a slave state, essentially it became I hate to use such a crass term, but it became a practice battleground
And
for
Tom,
the Civil War.
why was Kansas different than Missouri's entrance into the Union or Maine's entrance into the Union?
Because I think that at that point, it had become such an emotional issue. I often say that once emotion gets in the picture, reason leaves.
Well, but why did they choose the direct democracy route on the decision of to be a free state or a slave state?
Well, there's lots of little nuances to that, and essentially you ended up with, at one point, 2 different constitutions for the state of Kansas, where you had
At the
the
same
pro-Southern, you had a pro-Southern government in one part of the state, and then you had the pro-free slave. I mean, you had weapons being shipped in, you had
people moving in.
John Brown, and of course, Missouri would send over some of their citizens to vote, which, of course, that never happens now. People don't vote illegally. But you had people from Missouri coming
David
over.
Axelrod organized that campaign.
That's another topic.
We'll get to that later. But anyway, the people in Chicago love it. But no, but I mean, you had people from Missouri coming into Kansas to vote for but let's not, whitewash this, because you had those that were anti-slavery coming into Kansas as well that were probably illegally voting at the same time. So it became a bloody battleground.
Or legally voting, because people actually were moving there to try to effectuate the outcome that they wanted. So that was an open territory, and there was cheap land out there. I mean, have you ever been to Kansas? It's like
pretty wide open.
If you're watching
Once
this
you
in
get out of the
Kansas, we
major
love
cities.
you.
I mean, it's like there's a reason why people don't want a speed limit on the interstates in Kansas, so you can get through it. And Dorothy was out of her mind. She was on drugs. She really didn't want to go
And for those
home.
of you doing the Civil Discourse Now drinking game, you have to finish your shot due to the mention of Dorothy.
But essentially just a practice ground for, the violence that would later explode into the Civil War. I mean, you had John Brown even trying out some of his killing methods on pro-slavery settlers.
But John Brown then tried to take an armory at
Harper's
Ferry to effectuate an uprising of slaves to throw off the institution of slavery.
Yeah. And many would say that was, once again, kind of the final straw in the whole thing. Strangely enough, so many characters surrounded that would later turn up a couple years later in the Civil War, because you had Robert E. Lee leading the Marines. And strangely enough, the day John Brown was hanged, you had a voluntary soldier in the crowd named John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, indeed.
So,
I've seen the
who would
pictures.
turn up later on.
I've seen the photograph, John Wilkes Booth.
Yeah, and so it's but in many ways you had characters that would, once again, almost like a practice, if you will, for the Civil War. But Robert E. Lee, once again, still on the side of the United States.
There is one.
We're at the end of this segment, and we will be right back.